Good morning, Bill.
Mark, how are you?
Very good, thank you. Let me introduce myself, and then you can introduce yourself. I'm Mark Schmitt. I'm a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, and I've been a pretty regular participant on Blogging Heads here. But today we're starting something new, which is that the Roosevelt Institute itself, which is a think tank connected to the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York, and as a bunch of other activities. The Roosevelt Institute itself is going to be doing a fairly regular Blogging Heads feature, and this is the first. We're calling them Fireside Chats. We're going to have me and some of my other colleagues, like Mike Consul, who's been on Blogging Heads before, my colleague Ellen Chesler, and others, will be talking to people, typically people outside of Roosevelt. Sometimes conservatives we have disagreements with, sometimes people who are a subject that we don't know, but generally trying to have our own little corner here. So I hope this turns out well.
For our launch, I invited Bill Voegeli from Claremont McKenna College and the Claremont Institute, because he and I and a couple other people had been having a pretty interesting online argument about a book that Bill wrote that I think is really one of the most interesting conservative books of the last couple of years, called Never Enough. And I think it's made arguments that I think are not only fascinating challenges to liberalism, and I think in many ways I disagree with him, but I think it's a very important book. But also I think are relevant because they embody a lot of what I think I'm hearing from the language of particularly the Romney campaign, and a kind of casting of some economic arguments about the limits of government in very large, almost culture war terms. So Bill, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and then say a little bit about your argument in the book. There's also a nice article at the Claremont Review that I just downloaded from your own website, and I've only read about half of it, but that maybe will help viewers get a little bit of an introduction to your ideas and your argument.
Sure, Mark. Nice to be with you this morning again. I am indeed a visiting scholar at Claremont McKenna College's Salvatore Center. I am also one of two senior editors at the Claremont Review of Books, the quarterly publication of the Claremont Institute, a think tank geographically close to and one with many ties to the Claremont colleges, but a separate as they say, a separate 501c3, a separate nonprofit. And we're located on the very eastern edge of Los Angeles County. And I published a book, Encounter Books was the publisher, in Never Enough, America's Limitless Welfare State. It came out almost 2 years ago. The paperback edition is out any day. I would say the elevator pitch summary of the book is that stepping back from 80 years of debates now, going back to the speech where you're speaking to me from the Roosevelt Institute. You must know this. The term New Deal was introduced in FDR's acceptance speech at the 1932 Democratic Convention. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
I'm less of a great. There's some wonderful actual Roosevelt scholars at the Roosevelt Institute, and I'm less of a one.
Oh, okay. All right. Well. One of them will fact check this afterwards and let us know if yes. But I think that's true. So we're coming up on the 80th anniversary of the term the New Deal as a part of the American political vocabulary, and it seems
that's right. We should do some kind of celebration, some kind of massive celebration off of that.
Okay.
I appreciate your reminder.
Quick, call the development office.
Yeah.
So the frame of the book is that for 80 years now, longer if you go back before 1932 and take in the progressives, but let's say 80 years, American liberals have been saying that the American welfare state, our efforts in the realm of social welfare policy, social insurance, government programs to promote economic security are woefully insufficient. And so the book set out to wrestle with the question of, well then, what would sufficiency look like? And if sufficiency is not part of the discussion, what does that mean for the discussion that we do have going forward? So 80,000 words later, I sort of come to the conclusion that the answer to that question, what's the consummated welfare state, the one that doesn't need one new budget line, one new program? The answer to that question is that there is no answer to that question, that there's always going to be one additional need. To go back to something Steve Hayward says in the foreword to my book, Steve Hayward of the American Enterprise Institute, that once you sort of define your purpose in the world as slaying dragons, it's important not to run out of dragons. So the liberal mission is to keep finding things that need fixing.
Right.
So I think that without plowing into a lot of the number crunching about the growth of government programs over the years and the conservative response and the difficulties with that, I think that's the thing that the book tries to grapple with.
Right. No, I think that's a good summary of the book. Although there really is a lot in the book, and there's a lot of numbers, and there's a lot of interesting stuff. I guess I have I got kind of involved in this. I read the book 6 or 8 months ago, really for a different purpose, for an article I was trying to write that still hasn't quite come together. And then the folks at the Breakthrough Institute, which is a sort of a slightly quirky, interesting, mostly liberal, but again challenging little think tank started by my friends Michael Schellenberger and Ted Nordhaus, published a very interesting article by Steve Hayward, who you mentioned, from AEI, on modernizing conservatism, and the Breakthrough folks asked me to comment on it, and I think you and Steve are tracking along similar lines, and of course he cited you as well, and then you also commented on the article. So a kind of dialogue began that then I took up on the Roosevelt blog, New Deal 2.0, and you and Raihan Salam also joined on National Review. So it's an interesting debate that took place scattered across the internet.
I'm still hoping to write another at some point.
And I think it's an interesting challenge to liberals on two levels. One is to say, what actually is your, what is your, it's not, it's not socialism. It's not, as Mitt Romney says, they won't stop until everyone's absolutely equal, and it's not that. But it is difficult to define exactly what it is, and if I defined it for myself, that might not be the same as the definition for other people, and I think that's a useful critique of liberalism that one hears a lot from conservatives. I think you cite James Caesar. I think there's a couple other people along that line who've made the same argument that there isn't really a core principle in liberalism that we can build our vision around, or it's simply as Samuel Gopper said, it's simply more. More stuff, more social benefits, and I think you're leaning in that direction. I mean, I think that the dilemma there is that there are certain things. I mean, I said in my response that there are a lot of things that as a liberal we don't actually pursue. I use the example of I don't actually pursue single payer health care. I don't even think about single payer health care. I don't think man, if I could only have if we won the ideology lottery and the whole electorate changed, would it be great to get single payer healthcare? I know there are a lot of advantages to single healthcare, and I don't have good answers to people who say, single payer healthcare is the way to go. But, it's a political, I view it as something that has a political constraint. It's not going to happen. It's not worth exercising a lot of time on. And that, I think, what I argued is that that's actually a valid limit. The limits that derive from political debate and discourse are not necessarily less valid than those that stem from principle.
Provisionally, let's say that that's the case. It seems to me, however, that taking that position, you leave yourself. What then do you say to liberal advocates of single payer who say, all right, perhaps for the time being, single payer is not politically viable. It would not win a referendum. It can't pass Congress. That doesn't mean we shouldn't go out and argue for it and encourage people to side with it. If the entirety of your anti-single payer position is, well, it's not politically feasible, that's not an argument against any effort to render it politically feasible.
I guess that's right. I mean, I don't have an argument. If somebody says, I want to be out there advocating single payer, I don't have a very strong basis for saying, don't do that. I mean, I think there was a lot. One of the things that happened in 2008, in 2007, and maybe even starting a little earlier, and I think Paul Starr's book on health reform has a lot on this, there was a very, very creative, concerted effort to get the single payer advocates were the only, that was the only real constituency out there that was, really active on healthcare reform. And there was a very concerted effort to get them to understand, a private sector, subsidized model, with a public option, is really a good way to get to the basic goals that you have. So really, calm down about single payer, which is a big change from what happened in 1993 with Hillary Clinton, where the Clintons had a plan which kind of didn't satisfy anybody because it had all the traditional conservative opposition, and then the core liberal advocates on healthcare were single payer advocates, and they weren't particularly interested in the plan. So that effort to get single payer advocates to accept something less was there was an answer to that. Now that wasn't a principled answer. It was an answer of this is how you're going to get something done on healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Well, another question that came up in the course of this long discussion involving several people was, I believe, Steve Hayward brought it up and you responded to it, the question of comparable worth.
Right.
Where the government says, it's not enough to make sure that male nurses and female nurses are paid the same and that male truck drivers and female truck drivers are paid the same. If the reality is that most nurses are women and most truck drivers are men, then true gender equality in the pay envelope requires the government to step in and make a determination of the relative worth of truck driving and nursing, and to look at how much training is involved and years of school and stress on the job and a variety of factors, and somehow come up with a program that will render these inequities, inequalities, disparities, line everything up correctly. And Steve put that forward as a sort of a paradigm of boundless liberalism.
Right.
And you replied, if I've got the TikTok on this correct, you replied, "Oh, wait a minute. Steve had to go all the way back to the 1984 Democratic Party platform. It barely made it in there. Nobody's talked about it since. But that doesn't seem actually to be the case, and we've discussed that a little bit."
Right. I think that's I thought that was mainly Steve's response to my claim that we do have some limits. Is here's this liberals, he said almost got into the platform. In fact, it was in the platform in 1984. But to me, I thought that was an idea that had really gone by the wayside. And I don't know even at its peak, I dug a little bit into the history. I'm not sure it was necessarily truck drivers and nurses. I think there were workplaces where, two people who were basically driving trucks were maybe classified, given different classifications. And there were some states that did it with public employees, and it turned out fine. Now, I was wrong. I thought that this idea had been completely forgotten, and it turns out that Senator Harkin has, been reliably introducing the bill every year for every Congress for ever since the 80s, and has some Democratic sponsors. So it's not totally a gone idea. I do think it's one of those things. I do to me it's a good example of something where most liberals look at it and say, I know there's a lot of discrimination that takes that form. A lot of gender discrimination, but in fact, the idea of government coming in and creating this huge formal classification of what people ought to be paid is that's actually antithetical to our to free enterprise and would lock in a lot of disparities that I don't think are necessarily just. Anyway, I don't want to lock into law that Mitt Romney's hedge fund or Mitt Romney's private equity people should make more than truck drivers. If in some economic arrangement, truck drivers actually begin to get So I don't like that concept of worth as a fixed concept anyway. So that's why again, that's not even like single payer. That's not something I think would be great, but I think has some positives, but is politically not viable. It's something I don't think is a great idea on balance. And I don't, the fact that some people advocated it one time. I mean, this is a big pluralistic country. The fact that some factions advocated it, and at a time when the gender disparities in pay were far greater than they are now, is that's life. But I don't think that represents liberalism. But maybe the fact that the bill's been introduced, maybe it does. I don't know.
But so I think that's an important distinction, though. Your opposition to a single payer is top to bottom a political assessment, whereas your opposition to comparable worth is partly political and partly substantive. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I guess so. I know. I think my well, and comparable worth is, as I say, I don't think it's an issue. It hasn't been a live issue most of the time I've been an adult, so I didn't really have a thought out position on it until this debate came up. And I think my opposition to the fact that I don't pursue single payer, it's probably a mostly political objection. I mean, I'd want to see. I don't know that the substantively, what's the transition from the world we have now of healthcare and single payer? Maybe I think there are probably problems with that transition that maybe make it not worth really doing anyway, since we have so much of the institutions of healthcare built onto the current system. So I'm not sure I'd say it's top to bottom political, but it's mostly political, and that's I guess my real argument is that that's valid.
You mentioned something earlier. I wanted to double back to, if we could. We're talking about this in a sort of abstract way. This question of the sort of the liberal frame and the ultimate liberal goal, and I wonder what you think about this. We're both old enough to remember. When the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed a little over 20 years ago, a lot of people said, "Well, this is the death of American conservatism, because the only thing that's been holding the disparate parts of the conservative movement together, the one thing whatever else it is agree about, they have in common, is anti-communism." And that's no longer a binding force. So conservatism is in deep trouble now. And it's certainly, there's a lot to that, I think. But it also seems to me that if you go back to the 30s and 40s, the New Deal, Arthur Schlesinger's Vital Center, and so forth. This was a time when intelligent people thought that socialism or some form of pretty detailed, thorough national economic planning was a viable and desirable option. I mean, I think I quote a younger Arthur Schlesinger in my book, Never Enough, writing
right.
that.
You do, I remember that.
Where he says that there's no reason why a series of New Deals could not lead to, and he chooses his words very carefully here, to a kind of not undemocratic socialism. And so I guess my question is, we're now in the 21st century, we're in an era when it seems to me nobody really takes socialism seriously as an ideal. Nobody believes that there's a sort of viable third way. In one sense, it seems to me that renders the liberal project, if you want to call it that, it's a difficulty because if there's no ultimate goal towards which liberals are tending, and that's a frame of reference, then it seems that their efforts and their arguments wind up being sort of incoherent and scattered. There's kind of nothing but messing around for liberals to engage in. On the other hand, it's a problem for conservatism because messing around is very hard to argue against. It certainly doesn't sound dangerous, you know.
Right.
What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of interesting dimensions to what you said. First of all, I've always been kind of the school that believed that the Cold War did have actually was pretty good for liberalism. There's a great book by H.W. Brand, the historian, that makes that argument. And obviously, the Cold War helped create, for example, the federal role in education in the early '60s, and it really helped drive some of the civil rights movement as well. So I don't recall thinking, when the Berlin Wall came down, this is the end of conservatism. And there have certainly been any number of foreign threats as well that have on balance probably been over the last 20 years on balance been good for conservatives, certainly for the Republican Party. And I mean, there was a different world in the 50s and the 60s. The way we thought about the economy was quite different. It was a very different kind of Keynesianism. It was a very different, the role of the idea of government playing a role in some greater role in planning was prevalent, and we did have things that looked a little more like, really did look a little more like European social democracy, at least as one aspiration. And I think that's right. I think you're right that at the moment we don't have that, European social democracy frame. There are very few liberals, for example, who really want to, and some of my former colleagues at the American Prospect are kind of distinct among this, who really want to say, what was so wrong with reclaiming the idea of industrial policy? I mean, sometimes you do have to sort of take hold of your economy and say, if we want this level of manufacturing, we really want to revitalize manufacturing, we need to do some of the kinds of things that Germany does, for example. And so there's a little of that, but it's a really a loose strain. And I think that you're right that strain that wants to, actually think about the economy a little more aggressively. About what we can do, as opposed to simply managing pumping in money to pump when managing the business cycle which is really just in the aggregate, not on the specific.
Yes,
I think that more aggressive strain, I guess, is more anchored in a vision than maybe the looser strain that I think is represented by Obama or Geithner or the vast majority of congressional Democrats and probably most liberal intellectuals or whatever you want to call us. So, I think that's where I think your book really poses a challenge. Now, one answer to that would be to say, what we believe is, we don't believe in a series of new deals that will lead to, a more centrally planned economy or not a democratic socialism or anything like that. But we do believe in a basic platform that enables people to make the most of their talent, so that when you say, when Mitt Romney says liberals don't believe in equality of opportunity, they only believe in equality of results. I mean, I think that the answer is no. We believe absolutely in equality of opportunity, and we just have a different vision of what that is. That it requires supports beyond the very poor. That it requires some help with education, and ultimately that it requires the security of healthcare that's not tied to your job, so that you don't fall off the track completely when you lose your job or want to change your job or want to become start your own business or something like that. So another answer to your argument is that, and I think Matt Iglesias has made this argument, that in many ways healthcare, if it can be implemented properly, healthcare does complete the liberal aspiration, and then when you have that in place, a solid system of education that gets people to, up to the community college level or whatever, some of the basic, opportunity protecting, security bases, you're there. And that's maybe the liberal vision. Now that's different from, the full, the Schlesinger vision, which is also, 40 years old, 50 years old itself.
I noted a couple of months ago that Nancy Pelosi, not in a speech, I think in an interview, somebody asked her, what if the Democrats take back a House majority in 2012 and you're Speaker again, what will the top priority be? And she said, oh, definitely child care. The federal government does far too little in the area of providing programs that support child care for working mothers, middle-class mothers, and so forth. So I think even though the Affordable Care Act has miles to go before it's sort of locked in, that this problem is already on people's minds on Capitol Hill. My goodness, we've got what do we do next? And it sounds like people are starting to come up with answers to that question.
Okay, well, that's a good. I think that's a good response. Although child care is not a new issue, it's always been out there. I remember, when I worked on Capitol Hill, I remember the very end of the welfare reform debate in 1996, and I remember out in the corner, I was working for Senator Bradley from New Jersey, who was an opponent of the bill, so we didn't have a ton of leverage. I remember out in the corner seeing Senator Orrin Hatch, conservative, and Senator Chris Dodd basically sitting on a bench, madly scribbling out the numbers they could get for increased child care in the bill. So, and it actually turned into a huge increase that was probably one of the reasons why people were able to move off of welfare and into work, was because there was more support for child care out there. And so I guess I would just argue that child care at times has been part of a conservative aspiration as well.
Well, that's true. I think one of the things that the Roosevelt Institute can mention in its upcoming 80th anniversary gala fundraising program is that the New Deal has sort of defined the boundaries, the playing field of American politics since 1932, and conservatives have perhaps until kind of recently felt obliged to work within that framework rather than try to bring about a new framework. Even Ronald Reagan in the 1980s had to, sort of very carefully pick his battles and sort of lay out where he disagreed with the idea that the federal government had these fundamental responsibilities. So, it's people often people on your blue team often criticize Republicans for, and they'll contrast them with the sort of tractable, reasonable Republicans of days gone by. But those Republicans were politicians who were making politically necessary accommodations. It goes back a little bit to your the kind of argument you make about single payer. You can't take any politician and make the willingness to run a kamikaze mission the sole defining feature of political courage. There's a prudence that has to be involved, a careful calibration of what the available options are and how to steer towards an objective.
Well, it's part of your job in a democracy to be responsive to those things.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And so I think, thinking back on this, these back and forths we've been having on various websites over the past couple of months, I hope to write something more if I find the time. I still haven't really responded to the piece you did for the New Republic's website, where you drew some connections between the argument in Never Enough and some of the things Mitt Romney is saying.
Right, make a very generous interpretation of what Romney was saying.
Yes. Well, tragically, the book's sales figures don't argue that it's had that kind of influence, but maybe it's sort of captured something that's percolating throughout conservative circles these days. So the working title for my next piece is "I Was Mitt Romney's Callousness Enabler."
Well, that seems right. Let me go back a little bit.
Yeah.
To remind me, what were you saying I got distracted when you started talking about Romney.
Oh, yes. Well, going back to
how Reagan and others were kind of conditioned by New Deal assumptions, I guess. And,
yes, no, I think that's right. I mean, look at I grew up in Illinois in the 50s and 60s. Think of a guy like Congressman Robert Michael, the House Minority Leader for many years. Here's a man who had a long congressional career and never spent a single day in the majority. People talk nostalgically about what a congenial place Capitol Hill used to be. Well, when the Democrats assumed that no matter what, as they could safely between 1952 and 1992, that they're going to be in the majority, and the Republicans that they'll be in the minority, then that tends to everybody knows their place, sort of their roles, and there's a lot less friction. When things are more up for grabs, the fights get more intense.
Right. Well, there's also the fact that there were a lot of Republicans who were more liberal at that time than a lot of Democrats. So, the partisanship didn't cut along ideological lines. I just wrote a piece in the New Republic. I wrote a review of this wonderful new book about the moderate and liberal wings of the Republican Party by a historian named Jeffrey Cabot-Service. And one of the things that I got from that book, and kind of new, because I write in the review about the experience of when I worked on Capitol Hill, sitting behind the dais of the Senate Finance Committee with, 4 legendary moderate or liberal senators, John Chafee, David Dernberger, Bob Packwood, and John Danforth, and how they were in many ways better allies, better able to work with my boss than the really conservative Democrats on the other side, like John Burrow and David Boren. So I'm familiar with that. One of the interesting things in Cabot-Service's book is he talks about how the impulses of the liberal Republicans were for a kind of model of, they were strongly pro-civil rights, came out of that tradition, but that they had a model for social programs that was essentially small government, but would really support people's aspirations. So they were interested in things like, the negative income tax that almost became the family assistance plan under Nixon. They were interested in revenue sharing with the states. And they saw those things as ways of, supporting people's aspirations without creating a huge amount of bureaucracy. And they felt that, on their left were liberal Democrats who, wanted to do the same things, but create a lot of things like, community action agencies, things like that, that were a lot more elaborate. And on the right, there were both Democrats and Republicans, particularly Southern Democrats, who were simply anti-government in all respects. So, I think it's a tradition that was not simply conditioned by party warfare or by necessity, but was actually a vital part of the Republican tradition that had elements of conservatism as well as liberalism, and I think it's sad to have lost that tradition. As for Reagan, Reagan wasn't out of that tradition, although he worked with, he managed his way through the party really well at a time when it was a more diverse, ideologically diverse party. But there were certainly certain things. The defining experience of the Reagan administration was, this ham-handed attempt to cut Social Security, kind of pretty much out of the box in 1981 when Stockman went in and tried to slash the benefits for people who retire earlier than 65.
Yes, right.
And they just got knocked back completely. They wound up, the Senate immediately voted 99-1 to reject this idea, and that's how you wind up with the commission and on the bipartisan compromise. So certainly on Social Security, that was a real reminder. That's where the term third rail in American politics comes from. That was a real reminder. This element of the New Deal legacy, you do not mess with. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. I think it's a very important legacy of the New Deal. And Bush hit the same wall when he also, and I think in a ham-handed way, tried to cut it in 2005. Now, at some point, maybe that will change. Maybe today's seniors are not a New Deal generation anymore. Maybe their views of it change. Medicare, of course, has its own complicated politics. It is not a New Deal's program. It is a piece that was put in place in the Great Society. And yet, we do cut Medicare. Medicare is a huge problem. I think I look at all the numbers in your book, and if we can manage to bring down the healthcare costs that lead to the Medicare, cost projections, and to a lesser extent the Medicaid cost projections, if we can get that under control, which means actually getting healthcare spending under control, then the numbers in your book change very dramatically. And politically, Medicare, we want seniors to have healthcare, but it's not untouchable. Just because we think the Ryan plan is a bad way to do it doesn't mean that we don't cut Medicare. We cut Medicare in 1993. We cut Medicare in 1997. We cut Medicare. We do. And Republicans, I think, have been less responsible about actually cutting Medicare, particularly by adding Medicare Part D, which I don't think was necessitated by the political climate. I don't think it was necessary to make that as costly and reckless a piece of legislation. This is
the prescription drug benefit that was added to a Medicare?
The drug benefit, Medicare Part D is the drug benefit that was added in 2003.
3 or 4? Uh-huh. Yes. My recollection is that Republicans at the time thought this was doing nothing was not an option, that right. Democrats had an issue that they were going to flog aggressively if the Bush administration and the slender Republican majorities on Capitol Hill didn't come up with some kind of component to Medicare. And I think there was also let's put it this way, if you had Medicare, if Medicare had always covered prescription drugs, and you said, well, let's get rid of that part of it, people would say, what? If Medicare were a private insurance company, it would be very hard to explain at a shareholders meeting that we insure and pay out $75,000 for triple bypass operations, but don't cover a few $100s a year for anti-statin drugs that would render most of those triple bypass operations unnecessary, right?
Right.
So I think there were both political and not even ideological, but just sort of managerial arguments that led people the conservatives to think that it made sense to do something about the prescription drug benefit.
Right, but it's partly a question of how you do it, and doing it in a way that didn't actually do it. There were better ways to construct that benefit. There were better ways to manage costs within it. it's a more expensive program than it needed to be. I'm not saying we shouldn't have Medicare prescription drug coverage. I think we should, but I actually, frankly, think the Democrats would have done it in a smarter, cheaper way. But that's a counterfactual that I can't demonstrate.
Can I ask you sort of an ambush question?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Good. It seemed to me that in this writing dialogue we've had over the past couple of months, there's been sort of a debate and a meta debate. The debate has been about the usual stuff liberals and conservatives argue about. How big should the government be? What should it do? How should it do it? How should it pay for it? Stuff like that. And then the meta debate has been, how can liberals and conservatives talk about these disagreements in a way that's not that's productive and clarifying? Not necessarily that they split the difference or reach everybody winds up happy with the result, but that at least is politically useful to the broader world out there. Is that a fair characterization?
Oh yeah, and I think I've said, I think the line in your book that really bugged me the most was the line where you said we have liberals and conservatives have nothing really to talk about. And I felt like your book, along with a couple other inferior books, like I think of Arthur Brooks's book, The Battle, which is vastly inferior to your book, but follows some of the same lines. To cast this as these are two completely incompatible worldviews, and I just don't. Maybe that's right. Maybe that's. I don't think that's right, and I don't think that. I think there are incompatible. There are things where you don't bring them up at the Thanksgiving table because Aunt Lucy's views on abortion are her views, and your views are yours, and you're just not going to talk about it.
Yeah.
But I don't think that these kinds of economic issues are or should be in that category.
Fair enough. Now here's the ambush question. Okay. Noam Scheiber, is it, at New Republic? Scheiber. He linked the other day to something you wrote back in 2007 for the American Prospect. Uh-huh. That sort of touches on this question of how liberals and conservatives talk to each other. And I had read it before and kind of forgotten about it. I found it again and was very struck by it. Here's the passage that I found most interesting. Let me read it to you. The reason the conservative power structure has been so dangerous, and is especially dangerous in opposition, is that it can operate almost entirely on bad faith. It thrives on protest, complaint, fear. Higher taxes, you won't be able to choose your doctor, liberals coddle terrorists, etc. One way to deal with that kind of bad faith opposition is to draw the person in, treat them as if they were operating in good faith, and draw them into a conversation about how they actually would solve the problem. If they have nothing, it shows. And that's not a tactic of bipartisan Washington idealists. It's a hard-nosed tactic of community organizers who are actually aware of power and conflict. It's how you deal with people with intractable demands. Put them on a committee, then define the committee's mission your way. I guess as a conservative reading that and thinking about that, it was that last line, then define the committee's mission your way, that struck me as a notably bad faith definition of what good faith negotiating should look like.
I guess that's fair enough. That passage is from the article I wrote about Obama in 2007 that, attracted a little attention and people keep coming back to it. Where I was really trying, there was a big argument that, he's incredibly naive to think he can deal with these Republicans. They're just going to eat him alive. People like John Edwards, Hillary Clinton, they have a better sense of what it is to deal with the moderate Republicans. And, I wanted to argue that, in a sense, what the Obama approach was an approach that could get you, but either you can get that conversation going about the things you want to achieve, or you actually have some maneuver room if people aren't negotiating, aren't operating in good faith. Now, Noam's book, which I'm almost done reading, and which kind of inspired that particular piece. Noam's book it basically says, Mark Schmitt was basically wrong. I mean, the book doesn't mention that argument. But basically, the book says, you know what? It turned out to be wrong. That Obama, in fact, was simply naive about his ability to negotiate about the Republicans' willingness to negotiate in good faith. That it was all going to be pure opposition, and in fact, even the kind of calling them out on bad faith, which is really what I'm talking about there, that even that didn't really have very much effect politically, because they went into very strong opposition. I guess, I mean, maybe you're reading that piece to sound like in my saying, let's. I think we ought to be able to have that conversation, that it's some kind of a trap. I don't think it's. I said, if they have nothing, it shows. But if you actually have a viewpoint about where you want the country to go and what you want to do, then I think it can be a very productive conversation. I think conversations between liberals and conservatives, not just between moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans, but actually between liberals and conservatives about how you construct economic policy or healthcare policy. I mean, the conversations that led to, for example, the healthcare legislation that became the Wyden, what's his name from Utah, Wyden-Bennett bill in in 2005, 2006. Those were very, very productive and useful conversations where people started from where they really wanted to achieve and understood where each other were coming from. Now, when that got cast into the partisanship of we simply have to bring down Obama at all costs, that whole concept was out the window. I mean, it was as if there never was a Wyden-Bennett bill. It was as if 7 Republicans had never co-sponsored any kind of universal health care legislation. And that's really the bad faith that I'm. Essentially, it's not the bad faith of having your positions. It's the bad faith of walking away from your own positions on, in a political fight. Now, that's different from, you and I aren't elected officials. We're not playing in that game. That's different from what I think can happen in this arena.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I do think that, I'm 3,000 miles from Washington. I don't have many insights into how real politicians and people deeply politically engaged think about these things and approach these problems. But I do sense that there is a kind of lurking Republican fear that this advice of yours, get us, they're going to get us on the committee, and then the committee's mission is going to be to find their way, and we're going to be drawn into this thing and have, I think that is a reason why Republicans are, conservatives are often wary about invitations that Democrats think are just going to be, good, productive working sessions where we'll sit down and hammer out our differences and come up with something that everybody feels not great, but, good enough about. So I do think that it's that kind of apprehension that has led at least some conservatives to say we need not a different position within the liberal framework, but a completely different framework of our own.
Mm-hmm. I guess I could see that. I think liberals have the same apprehension. Obviously, people felt like, a lot of liberals felt like the Bowles-Simpson Budget Commission was, something that was, a committee whose mission was actually defined. It wasn't the way that they would necessarily do it, but they jumped in and they participated, and a lot of the liberal Democrats actually voted, like Dick Durbin actually voted for the recommendations. So, there's a little more good faith participation, even when you think it's a trap. I think there's a little more good faith participation by liberals. But one way or another, maybe I should, maybe I regret writing that sentence, because one way or another we have to get out of that. Somehow we have to be able to govern this country in a way that's not simply, one side claims all the power and then the other side claims all the power. And certainly I do think, there was a major good faith effort at the beginning of the Obama administration. I mean, one of the central dramas was the 7 months that they spent trying to, with Max Baucus trying to get some kind of bipartisan or left-right conversation about healthcare. And if anything had ever come of that, that's what the law would be. And it didn't happen. And maybe there's an excuse for that wariness. I mean, I think in any situation of mutual total mistrust, there's probably some excuses on both sides. Although there's nothing quite like the bad faith behavior of the Republican congressional majority in the Bush administration. There's nothing quite like that in our political history. There are many ways in which the Democrats didn't treat Republicans right, and when they were in the majority in the House. But there's nothing quite like that, including the way they went about passing the prescription drug bill in 2003 that we've talked about. So there's a lot of there's a lot of reason for believing bad faith. But one way or another, I mean, I just don't accept that we can't. That we have to live in that world where there is no conversation. I don't know what the possibilities are for democratic self-governance under those conditions.
Yes. Well, circling back to Never Enough, I think I brought that up, that sentence you quoted up to say this is the dead end we'll get to if both sides take certain uncompromisable, intractable positions. Then there's nothing to talk about. That's right. But that was not a thing I was celebrating or a course I was recommending. So
right. But then of course I think your critique of liberalism as somewhat incoherent and unprincipled, and maybe more driven by political conditions, as I think both political but people in both sides are. That critique. It's hard. I mean, liberals are quite malleable. I mean, I think that to the extent that you're right about that, I think it does create the grounds for some conversation. We are pretty adaptable, and and as much as we haven't gotten much of an expansion of the welfare state. In the last 30 years, we finally got something on healthcare, which was the great aspiration for the entire 80-year span. Well, that is, we finally got something on healthcare outside of the elderly, and that's a big deal. But it's really one of the few big, steps forward. So, liberals are pretty humbled by the last 35 years of American politics.
Well, I think to say that liberals haven't gotten much in terms of expanding the welfare state. Disregards the built-in expansion that happens simply by standing there and letting the machine run on its own. Right. I mean, this is. I'm no sort of quantitative social scientist, but I can put together a spreadsheet if I download stuff from the Office of Management and Budget historical tables, and you take the Census Bureau's annual population figures, and you take any sort of good. They offer half a dozen different deflators to adjust for inflation, and it turns out that what they call human resources outlays, which is Social Security, Medicare, all other income support programs like unemployment compensation, all other health programs like Medicaid and S-CHIP, and then all federal programs in education, job training, social services. You take on a constant dollar per capita basis, you compare where we were just before the big recession started in 07 and 08. It's twice as much as in the late 80s, and that was twice as much as I think in the early 70s. So it's to say that the welfare state hasn't grown. That just I think you have to qualify that and say that the formal measures of the welfare state hadn't been added to. But the welfare state can grow without Congress passing a single bit of legislation. It grows because more people apply. It grows because the administrators, who have a great deal of discretion over the program, they're human beings. They're people don't go into social work to be hard asses, basically. So these cases come up for disability insurance and so forth, and you have to draw a line distinguishing who's eligible from who's ineligible, and that line by inertially seems to get pushed out a little bit every year, every budget cycle.
Right. Well, I mean, that's a small subset, disability and eligibility for disability, which has expanded on SSI and SSI for kids and, been reformed a couple different times. That really has expanded, but that's a small, that area where it's actually social workers making individual determinations is a pretty small part of that overall growth. The big part of that overall growth is simply health costs. And I don't think I don't view throwing more and more money into a wasteful health system as an expansion of the welfare. And it's not an expansion of welfare in the sense of general well-being. It simply isn't. And getting that under control is a very, very important liberal goal. I don't think we're better off with I don't think we're better off with a government that spends more money if it's not spent well. I don't think we're better off with that human resources component of the budget being bigger if that's not actually resulting in greater well-being. Now, so in some cases it is, because there are life-saving treatments and things like that we didn't have in the 80s, and there are some things that and we want those things to be available to people. So some costs are going to go up simply because those things do exist, but that doesn't feel to me like we're really expanding the range of things that we're protecting people against. We're really providing the kind of economic security, and when you look at the measurable decrease in economic security that Jacob Hacker and others have shown, it's not like we're doing more to. It's not like the ability of people to be protected and make their way in the world is greater, and many vital programs like unemployment insurance are basically broken. So it's not like I'm thrilled with the way the welfare state has worked just because it costs more, but I agree it does cost more.
Okay. Let me ask you about taxes, and specifically, I don't know if this Matthew Iglesias article appeared when you were still American Prospect editor.
It did. I know the piece you're going to refer to.
Yeah. Okay. Where are you on that? Where are you on Iglesias' condemnation of Barack Obama's pledge never to raise taxes on anyone making less than $250,000 a year?
I am right behind him. I think that was one of the grave mistakes, and it was interesting because it wasn't a mistake of again, I mean, Noam Scheiber's book kind of makes the argument that a lot of the kind of new politics that Obama talked about was really naive. It was very ordinary. It was nothing new. It was very ordinary, sort of Chuck Schumer style politics to say nothing over 250, nothing under 250. But I think it's incredibly short-sighted. I think we will need the revenues. I think that I pay astonishingly low taxes. I think the amount of income that somebody like me, which is basically, two-earner middle-class household, the amount of our income that we're able to essentially shield in things like 529 accounts and IRAs and Roth IRAs. I don't actually use I don't use a Roth IRA on principle. Because it's
what's the principle?
Denying the government so much revenue. I mean, I think our taxes should be higher. There's no, it's really outrageous, and I think Mitt Romney's taxes should certainly be, effective tax rate should be much higher as well. But I think the illusion that it's all about somebody else, it's all about somebody in that 1% or 5% or whatever. Is a real abdication of the responsibility that most of us in our level, we shared a great deal of the prosperity of the 2000s. to the extent that we still have reasonable middle class incomes, it's an indicator that we didn't take that massive hit from the recession. For the most part, my family didn't, and that's where I think the obligation is enormous. And I wish the president would talk about. I wish we did have a little bit of a language of some shared sacrifice that doesn't all simply fall on the super wealthy.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree with Iglesias then, who I believe in a tweet somewhere said that the Democrats' failure to even broach the subject of tax increases on those making less than $250,000 a year makes the triumph of something like Ryanism inevitable?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think it makes the triumph of Ryanism inevitable, although I guess it does leave you in a situation where you're always. I mean, no, I don't think it has to be Ryanism. I mean, I think obviously, you need a balanced package of some tax increases and some spending cuts, and those spending cuts have to come out of Medicare, but they don't have to be Ryan. But obviously, the more constrained you are on taxes, and the other problem with the 250,000, of course, is that before long, it's inevitable that, Nancy Pelosi has said this and Chuck Schumer has said this, I'm not really sure that 250,000 is really rich, and of course in San Francisco and New York, it isn't necessarily, there are plenty of people who find themselves in that. I know plenty of people whose income probably edges over 250,000, and you sort of grow up thinking, man, if I ever made $250,000, I'd be lighting my cigars with $100 bills. And, the reality is you're not, especially as people in that range tend to like private schools and things like that. So, they're not basking in cash, and they don't necessarily think of themselves as rich, especially not when compared to their, when you're in that zone, people who are genuinely rich. So, you don't think of yourself as rich. So there's inevitably an inflation about it, as people like Pelosi and Schumer get a little reluctant, and so now we're moving into the area where we're really talking about some kind of millionaire tax, which I just think is I just don't think it's I don't think it's the right policy, and I don't think in the long run it's really smart politics to continually say it can all go on someone else out there.
But what I took Iglesias to be saying was that if Democrats don't have the confidence either in their own sort of rhetorical abilities or in the American electorate's judgment and willingness to take in the idea that higher taxes and a thicker web of social benefits, that's a good thing. If you can't close that sale, then it sort of makes sense for conservatives, for Republicans to say, look, we're going to live within the budget constraint defined by the taxes you guys are willing to stump for, and if that's really no higher than the 18% of GDP that has kind of been the traditional share of the federal government's revenue stream, then we're going to have to figure out a welfare state that fits that size. If you folks, if the blue team wants to go out and make the arguments and get the votes to say to people, we're going to raise your taxes and we're going to fund new programs and we'll all be better off, go make that argument. But unless you do, and until you do, then we don't really have a way forward here.
Well, that may be right, and I do think Democrats need to be thinking instead of constraining themselves in that way. Do need to be thinking about what are the things that we want to be doing to really help people understand the case for government, understand what the value you're getting, understand why even if you're not getting a benefit at this moment, it's actually of value to you as a kind of social insurance. I think there are a number of areas where that's where the groundwork has to be laid, and I think if you have this conversation with a Democratic politician who wants to or whoever the Obama strategists were, David Axelrod, whoever who set that $250,000 limit, their answer back is going to be, until you get people to really believe in government, we're constrained in this way. And then I think your response, you're creating a framework where it's it's the Democratic Party's responsibility to, get the taxes we need. And the Republicans will constrain it. I think that's, I'm not seeing it on the Republican side. Ryan is the exception. More often in practice, what you have is things like the, Medicare Part D, where there's actually a desire there is an impulse to do those things, to follow in that New Deal tradition, without actually paying for it. So, I think there's some way of bringing that together where you say to Republicans, there's a certain level of government that you want too. And it obviously in the case of Mitt Romney, it involves significant defense spending. And it's not like Ryan solves all the problems in the long run either. And there's a lot of cost there too. So there's still some responsibility for bringing your tax and budget lines together. But you still have somebody like, you have somebody like Grover Norquist who says, all I care about is, I don't care about the gap between taxes and revenues. All I care about is the gap between spending and revenues. All I care about is revenues going down and staying down. And that's a strong impulse on the Republican Party as well.
It is. In fact, I have a piece that should be out soon in City Journal that it talks a little about Norquist particularly, but it kind of takes that side generally, saying, sort of making the argument for anti-tax absolutism, sort of for holding the line on the GDP slice that goes to government, and it's not, I think, about fully embracing the supply side argument. It's not about fully embracing Norquist's famous statement about shrinking government to the size where you can drown it in a bathtub. I think the core of the argument is, to go back to what we said before, that the given the welfare state's natural expansionary tendencies, that until and unless liberals belly up to the bar and say, Americans, we need higher taxes than all of you, that conservatives, Republicans don't have any obligation to sort of bail them out of that problem they've created for themselves.
Well, I want conservatives to bail yourselves out of the problem you've created for yourselves, And I think, one of the innovations of Steve Hayward's piece and of your book is to kind of challenge the, what's been called the starve the beast theory, which really allows you to say, as long as we starve the government of revenues, eventually it'll shrink on its own. So we don't really have that obligation to step up on actual budget cutting. And I think you're basically saying, A, that you do, and I'm saying, you also have the obligation to step up on revenues to the extent that you also envision a certain level of government. And there, I think there is a possibility of, at that point, I think you can begin to have the conversation where you also step up on revenues on the liberal side to meet the obligations that we think government has. But also, there's plenty of budget cutting that I think liberals are willing to do. Or certainly, obviously, we're willing to do it in some areas of defense, and I think we are and should be willing to do it on Medicare costs. We have to be.
Do you consider the Paul Ryan, Ron Wyden collaboration encouraging or horrifying?
I don't consider it horrifying. I do think that it's something that's not going to go anywhere, but gives some sense of bipartisanship to what is essentially Ryan's plan, which I think is a quite poorly designed plan. I think it's really, my view, I'm definitely not of the view that, you must never get in bed with these people. And I think that's an interesting, I think there's a liberal political argument that says every time we get in here, we get screwed. which is the counterpart to your argument that, we're just trying to trick you to come to the table and then we'll define the terms of the committee. And I think there's a ton of examples from that, particularly from the 2000s. There's a dozen examples of that. So that there's a liberal argument that says don't even, people were horrified by Obama's negotiations with Boehner over the summer by broaching topics like raising the Medicare eligibility age, things like that. That's where I think we reach a dead end. I'm not horrified by that. I think you have to do that. But I think there are some choices. I still think there are some policy choices in that process that are horrifying to me. I don't think raising the Medicare eligibility age is a good idea, and I don't think that the basic premium support structure of Ryan or Wyden Ryan kind of quite makes sense. But I'm not horrified in the sense of like you must never have anything to do with these people.
Well,
all right. Well, we are at an hour and 10 minutes.
Good God.
I think we should. I think we'll have an opportunity to do some of this again at a conference in June. So let's save some of our ammunition, I guess.
Fair enough.
Unless you may have other. I thought that Andrew's question was actually very interesting and challenging to me. So you can find another one for June, and I'll find one to spring on you. But I really appreciate your doing this. I think we will link to all the pieces that we've been writing, and I hope this was a good start for the Roosevelt series.
I hope so too, Mark.
Okay.